Hello, everybody. Evening, rather, and apologies for missing the afternoon class due to certain commitments. Now, in this particular session, what we are going to discuss is Stern's challenge to plot and character, or rather, the question as to how Stern treats the elements of realist plot and character in Tom Jones, in Tristram Shandy. Now, for that, let me try and share a PowerPoint with you on that. Give me a minute, please. Right. Now, in the last discussion, we talked about how this novel emerges as one of the first really overt metafictions of the English novel, and how Stern's plot is minimalist, and that the entire agenda of the novel is to question and exhibit the ways in which the novel is written. Now, if you notice carefully that the realist novel is primarily plot oriented, in the sense that there's a clear definition of a beginning, a closure, and continued through adventures. Also, there's a very definitive sense of time and place. There's a pattern of causation, and that even if there are subplots, the main plot moves in a kind of a circular or linear progression. So there might be smaller digressions, but largely the process in which the plot moves is quite defined. The Stern is going to actually try and deconstruct all of these paradigms. So I would like to alert you to the way in which, since we're doing these two novels together, Fielding has constructed the plot in Tom Jones, and how Stern is deconstructing that in Tristram Shandy. Now let us look at this very concept of the beginning of the story. Now, as you know, the classical idea of beginning has two kinds of phenomenon. One, which the epic uses, is in the middle of things, medias res. So suddenly you have the hero coming through and the adventures begin. You can go back in a flashback, go forward in flash forward, and so on and so forth. The other is called ab ovo, or begin at the beginning. So generally, as you've seen, in Tom Jones, the novel begins with the birth of the protagonist. So from the birth, the Stern is going to interrogate this and play around with this idea. Ab ovo is from the egg. So when does life begin? Life begins when the parents are meeting and the egg is formed, as it were. So immediately Stern, what he does is, since this is a story about Tristram, life and opinions of Tristram Shandy gentleman, he goes back to the point where Tristram is, as it were, created, the egg from which he is born. And therefore, Stern, in a stroke of innovation, goes back to the point where his parents are copulating and where he is being formed. So this very idea of beginning is, as it were, interrogated. Now, again, if you notice this point where Walter and Mrs. Shandy have actually a marriage contract in which, you know, it's clearly written that, once a month at least, they will have to exert themselves sexually. And at the point when this happens, uh, Mrs. Shandy is actually thinking about the, you know, winding the clock. So the screwing motion, as it were, and winding the clock. So, right at the beginning of the beginning, there is this element of association. The element of association that I'll be talking about when we discuss Locke and philosophy. But that one incident is associated with the other. So it is thus that, the beginning of the novel is taken to a point beyond the beginning, and the very notion of where the novel begins is questioned. The second aspect that Stern does is this element of causation. So Stern is playing around with time. So the incident number one might be when, Tristram is about to be born in book one. And in the very next chapter, it might be an episode when Tristram is 5 years old. It might be when he's 3 years old. So it is the entire segment of Tristram Shandy, the entire 9 books, are as it were jumbled up in time. So in one, the hero is adult. In the next, he can be a child. In the next, he is yet to be born. So this very element of causation, this linear kind of a progression, is being continuously disrupted so that we can witness how it is the novelist who creates these kinds of gradings, and how he can, if he chooses, disrupt them very often. So conventional openings and the question of causation is, as it were, problematized. As you see, Tristram is born well into the third book of the novel. And by the time the novel has ended, he's merely 3 years old, yet the book is about Tristram Shandy, gentlemen. He has flash forwarded in him into, maturity, brought him back. So his locks have turned gray, and then he's become a child. So the entire plot does not really have any temporal sequence or spatial sequence. Of course, it's located primarily within a small household, but it is random. The movement of plot is entirely random, so that there is no link between different episodes. And as I said, the novel begins with Tristram, or rather, it begins with Walter and Mrs. Shandy trying to create Tristram. Does not at all, talk about Tristram's growth. Walter Shandy wants to write the encyclopedia called Tristopedia on the growth of Tristram. And he finds that, Tristram's growth outstrips his writing capacity, so that if he's recording part of Tristram's growth, Tristram has grown even more. So the failure of the novel to actually put into words the actual pace of growth is a feature that Tristram Shandy is playing around with. And at the end, again, it does not end with Tristram. It ends with Widow Wadman wanting to know where Toby has been wounded. Toby thinks it's in the siege of Namur. Widow Wadman thinks Toby is going to show him the exact spot on his groin. And by the time the novel has ended, Toby is scandalized and sitting in the parlor, and suddenly the novel comes to an end, announcing with Yorick announcing that this is a cock and a bull story and one of the best of its kind I ever heard. So the story has no real beginning, it has no real end, it has no real chain of incidents. It's just a couple of incidents jumbled together, a couple of characters brought together, and the time period is randomly played around with. The other major challenge that Stern actually perpetrates is through digressions. Now, Stern begins with the idea, and though hyperbolic, it's true, that he begins one sentence and trusts Almighty God for the second. So, where his chapters go, nobody knows. How and where these digressions sort of creep in is difficult to determine. So, it's almost muddling in the way there are different kinds of digressions all shooting off in the course of the main event and then taking on its own course, merging with the novel, then reappearing again. So digressions are, as it were, pervasive in the novel, and the major plot is overtaken by the digressions. So E.M. Foster talks about the charmed stagnation about the whole epic because nothing happens. The more the characters do, the less gets done. And Foster was to talk about a god hidden in Tristram Shandy, and his name is Muddle. Stern himself, very interestingly, talked about the mystical labyrinth. May I remind you here that Borges, the postmodern writer, also talks about labyrinths, that mystical, zone in the Icarus Daedalus myth where you got lost. Of course, the major critic of metafiction, John Barth, who writes an important essay called The Literature of Exhaustion, which began metafiction really in the 1970s, also used the title for his novel, Lost in the Funhouse. So, this sense of getting lost within the labyrinths of fiction, trying to negotiate how to get out, how to write, is a term that even, Stern uses, with every digression creating a new part of the labyrinth. And look at what Stern has to say. Digressions incontestably are the sunshine. They are the life, the soul of reading. Take them out of this book, for instance, and you might as well take the book along with them. So, what is the point of the digression? There are numerous digressions. There's no doubt about that. But what is the point of the digression? And Stern argues there that I defy the best cabbage planter to go on coolly, critically, and canonically, planting its cabbages one by one in straight lines and stoical distances. So Stern is interrogating this concept of time once again, that every moment in one's life cannot be the same. So at one moment you might be very happy, at one moment it might be boring, at the other moment you might be very, very emotionally upset. Is that 1 second of this time similar to the 1 second of that time? Now, in terms of time, philosophers have called this the theory of Dewey. Henri Bergson pointing it out that time should not be sort of measured in terms of seconds, but in terms of duration, of the duty of the experience that the time has. So one moment might actually be stretched out into 1,000 hours, and another moment might just be a moment in itself. Right. So, and this, if you look at that passage there from Stern, and you think about Virginia Woolf's essay called Modern Fiction, where Virginia Woolf talks about life as not being a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. They're a luminous halo of thought. Then the same kind of questioning of the linear idea of plot and time seems to be voiced by both Sterne and Woolf. In fact, one of the great admirers of Sterne was, of course, the modernist writer James Joyce. So, this theory of duration, this theory of randomness, is again something that periodically punctures and interrogates the notion of plot, showing how the narrator is actually sort of selecting one incident among many and putting it across in a organized narrative. What were the stream of consciousness narrative doing? Right at this moment when I'm taking a class, I may be concentrating about Tristram Shandy and thinking about tomorrow's office work, the work that I have to do for Saraswati Pujo. I have thinking about the dress that I'd be buying. So a number of things are flooding my brain. But how am I sort of arranging them? I'm artificially selecting them so that I can present one version of the teacher who is selecting, text, reading them, and teaching. At the same time, my mind is the cauldron. That's what the stream of consciousness narrators wanted to do. They wanted to present this randomness within the human mind. What Sterne is wanting to do is he's trying to show through this randomness or through this random cluttering of the plot or throwing the plot apart. He's trying to show how the plot is an artificially constructed thing which is determined by the author. And therein lies the metafictional challenge to plot in Tristram Shandy. Now, if plot is one of the major parameters of realism, then the other major parameter would, of course, be character. We've seen how, in Tom Jones, for example, the realist novelist has taken up, characters in identifiable situations, given them proper names, created unheroic heroes, created typed characters, and so on and so forth. The Sterne is going to do almost the same thing. He is not going to present us with any character at all, any real character at all, one who has any kind of vertical depth. Right, remember that characters can be horizontal and vertical. Those with vertical depth who change over the course of the novel, they are vertical, round characters, as E.M. Foster would put them. And those who merely oscillate horizontally or reveal only one kind of temperament, they are called the flatter kind of characters, two-dimensional characters, while the round characters are the three-dimensional characters. The Sterne, of course, does with a minimum number of characters. There are hardly few. And the major ones are the father, Walter Shandy, the uncle, Toby Shandy, and you have a couple of other characters, but they don't matter really, and Widow Wadman, of course. Now, there's this question as to whether they can at all be called valid characters. And Sterne uses the term hobby horse to refer to them. Now, the hobby horse is a kind of a horse-like frame strapped to the waist. It's a Morris dance. So, in one of these folk dances, you would actually sort of strap on a horse kind of a figure and you would dance nonsensically. So in this particular novel, that hobby horse which the person rides is actually a dominating aspect of him. So the character is actually not humanized, he's dehumanized in the sense that he is marked by the preeminence of one character trait. অর্থাৎ একটা চারিত্রিক বৈশিষ্ট্য সেটাকে it is enlarged. What is that? So for example, in Walter Shandy, this is the intellectual, আমরা বাংলায় যাদের আঁতেল বলি, right? So everything has to be philosophized. Childbirth has to be philosophized. This entire process of child rearing will become his project encyclopedia. So every single incident he will try to intellectualize. And this is what is the ridiculous figure of what in the classical tradition is known as the Philosophus Gloriosus, or one who tries to bring in philosophy into everyday life at every point of time. On the other hand, if Walter Shandy represents pure philosophy, the Philosophus Gloriosus, Toby represents sentimentality, the refusal, the withdrawal into sentimentality, copious tears, a withdrawal from life, and a sort of furious desire not to harm anything, right? So much so that it becomes ridiculous. So on the one hand, you have the purely dry intellectual Philosophus Gloriosus. On the other hand, you have the extremely, uh, soft, sentimental, naive. And Sterne calls these characters hobby horses. Let us just go through what Sterne has to say. He says a man and his hobby horse uh, are in the same manner in which the soul and the body do upon each other. So they are electrified bodies. So uh, this is a man who is tied to only one aspect of character. So Walter and Toby are therefore attitudes rather than characters. Walter as the Philosophus Gloriosus and Toby as the sentimental naive. Yet Sterne is giving them individual traits. So you have Walter with his gait, his enormous stomach, he's sitting crouched in that armchair in the parlor whose picture I showed you. And Toby is, of course, this wounded man who has on the groin a wound and is playing around with the siege of Namur. See, once again, Toby has actually kind of sort of demystified the violence of war and created a kind of play battleground where he's no longer engaged with reality, but is in a world of make believe. And the entire Shandy household is taken away from the capitalist worldview of the British novel and put into a zone of pure fantasy and play. It's a house of, as it were, magic, really. So it's kind of magical realism where every character is a kind of a make believe figure who's engrossed in his own universe. Therefore, what I'm trying to suggest is Sterne is deliberately violating the realist notion of character, where characters are placed in their milieu, historically situated, motivated psychologically, have definite names, go through adventures, are drawn from different classes. Sterne takes a minuscule segment of society, sort of looks at them and creates almost caricatures through which he's trying to construct a kind of a pseudo biography, which he then violates. So together, plot and character sort of kind of collapse in Tristram Shandy. And thereby, in this collapse, they show how Sterne is experimenting with or writing back against the notions of and uh, character and plot. Now, I will, of course, at this point of time, pause here because we've talked significantly about two important issues of the novel. In my next presentation, I will talk about the other challenges that Sterne does. One is the challenge to philosophy, and the other is the challenge to the philosophical concept of time. Although I've talked about time a little bit today, but I'll talk about how Sterne plays around with time and how Stern plays around with both, you know, Locke and Hume. So that I think I'll leave for the morning of Sunday, which is the 7th, I'm sorry, the 6th of February. And I'll slate a 10:30 class where we can deal with these two major issues in Tristram Shandy. It's been a long day, and I'm sure all of you are tired. I thank you for your patience in joining this particular class and wish you a very good night. Thank you once again.